It's very important you understand that coding standards have their limits. They are not a silver bullet by any means. Anyone who says, adopt these coding standards and your quality will go through the roof is a snake oil salesman. There's no two ways about it. It's part of an overall approach to quality. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a worked example of how I go about writing quality standards for people. I've done this professionally. In fact, Chris has actually worked with these. You'll recognize those, my friend, don't you? Yep. So if I was writing a quality standard, here's what it looks like. And I'm going to break this down and we're going to walk you through everything that's in there and why it's in there. And if you're at the back, don't worry, the slides will be online later if the screen's a bit small to see. The first and most important thing to open with is a priority. I imagine a lot of you work with JIRA or a similar ticket system, and you know what it's like when you've been bombarded from all sides and you're told everything's top priority. And what happens? Nothing's top priority as a result. Yeah? So you want to avoid that trap. You want to establish a set of priorities. And I found that a three-level approach works really well when working with teams of up to 50 people, which is what I've actually used these particular ones on. The language matters as well. So I'm avoiding Moscow-type language, which is must, should, could, etc., that you'll see in other standards, because they start to imply things are optional. And one thing I want to get across here is that's not what the priority is about. They're not saying things are optional at all. Everything in a coding standard is mandatory if you're improving quality. The point of priorities is to focus where your time goes. See, problem with code at the end of the day is zero defect code is possible. I've worked on a project involving NASA code. I know it can be done. The thing is, you can't afford it. It costs so much to do zero defect code. It's always a trade-off. Because you're managing where your time goes. Where your time goes while you're writing code, where your time goes on code reviews, but hopefully you're investing a bit more time on those two things to avoid time spent on rework. And I've spoken about rework in the past. I did a talk at Glasgow last year. That video is already up on YouTube. A whole talk on the costs of rework. It's about code coverage and making sure it's 100% at the minimum. So as I said before, it is possible to do zero defect code. Chances are you just can't afford it. Because there's always these three tensions all pulling in. And certainly these days, fast is becoming more heavily weighted than ever before. I remember in the first dot-com boom, we used to talk about this thing called internet time, and we used to scoff at it because it was an illusion. But you look at how quickly now people bring stuff to market. The world has changed. So the whole point of priorities, with your key criteria, you want everybody involved in the code review to be checking that those key criteria are being met. That's the whole point of them, multiple pairs of eyes. So you're reducing the chance of something slipping through. Your major criteria, you divvy them up between the people in the code review. Hopefully you've got at least 3 people in the code review. That's a good minimum number. So you divvy them up between everyone involved in the code review and say, you look at this, you look at this, and you look at this. It increases the chance that something will slip through, but at least you're trying to catch everything. Then your minor priorities. They're things that really should become internalized over time with developers. So when new people join the project, you'll spend a bit more time with them or join your organization, training them on how you do things. But after a while, you shouldn't be having to explicitly go through that list in a code review. There'll be things you'll just start to spot out because you'll recognize as problems. So they should become a given over time. And that's how I split up these 3 categories. If your minor priorities, let's say you're 6 months in and your minor priorities are still coming up all the time in your code reviews, maybe it's because it's not actually a minor criteria. It needs to be changed to a major one. But it can also be an indicator that somebody sat in the wrong seat. And it's something to be aware of. You may sometimes have to use this to change your people. So that's priorities. Remember, not mandatory. It's about spending time on things that have the biggest impact. They need IDs. I should have really said with PSR2 it doesn't have IDs, therefore it can't possibly be a standard. But that felt a bit churlish. Every single coding standard, give it a unique ID number. Because it allows you to share them much more easily. You're doing a code review, you can just say, this code needs changing because of, coding standard blah, 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 and just give a link to the ID. You don't have to say in detail what's being violated all the time. You can use the numbers. You can be concise. The thing with the IDs is make sure they're immutable. They must mean the same thing forever. The standards themselves are not immutable. Your coding standards are living documents. They're going to change over time. You're going to learn and improve. The scope of the work you're doing will change over 3 to 5 years. So you want to make sure that your standards are evolving, but your IDs stay the same. Because if you've got someone who's joined a project after 2 years and everyone's using a set of IDs, and then someone new joins and they're reading the documentation and your standards and they realize they've got new IDs, all of a sudden you've got people using IDs but meaning different things. You want to avoid that. As you're improving your standards, if what that particular coding standard means something different, if it changes, give it a new ID. And if necessary, retire the old one. There's nothing wrong with that. My advice is use a structured system, because you can easily end up with 200 to 300 of these over time. And if it's unstructured, it's really hard to work with. I use priority and category, which I'll go into in a moment, and then I just allocate the next available number, within that category. Find a system that works for you. It's really helpful to have standards grouped together. Especially as chances are you're chucking them in a table in something like Confluence, rather than having a dedicated app where you've got nice sorting for them. So categories. The whole point of categories is to group things together. And here's some categories that I've used. And again, Chris will recognize many of those. I used to actually run a QA team and looked at projects, including ones that Chris was working on, which was good fun. That's how I met Chris. Now, I'm not pretending for a moment that's an exhaustive list by any means. But the whole point of categories, they're concepts or themes that run throughout your code. And they emerge as you talk about things and you find common language. And again, that list, you can see you've got things like API design as a theme, the way you manage your packages as another theme, logical layering as a concept, for example, robustness as a concept. Now, one of the reasons I like grouping them together like this is you need to actually have an active process for reviewing your standards. And if you can pull out everything that says cover API design and go through it, you sat down together, it's easy to stop then and see, oh, hang on, we haven't got anything that describes this. It's easy to spot gaps. Next up is criteria. And the key thing about criteria is it tells us what success looks like. It's much better to describe success than a lot of prohibitions. So here's some examples. Capturing activity in an activity log. Making sure responses are JSON, especially when errors occur, which can be challenging. Making sure you're not supporting GET requests that have request bodies, because they're not part of the standard and they're not reliable, so you shouldn't support them. These are some examples. Now, when I'm writing these, my success criteria is always a single sentence. Always. Like that one I've highlighted there, it's a single sentence. In terms of writing style, I use something called active voice. There's nothing passive about that. There's nothing passive-aggressive about it either, which is, when people start writing this stuff down, that can be a big challenge at first. Make sure they are clear. There's no ambiguity. I use words like all and always and never. Make sure there's no wriggle room for that. Because if there is, you'll spend so much time arguing over whether the criteria needs to be met or not that you might as well not have it written down in the first place, in reality. If you're new to writing this kind of style, GDS down in London have done a fantastic job of documenting how to write in this kind of style. They've got a huge style guide online. Can't recommend it highly enough. And that QR code and that link will take you there. Now, with a coding standard, you want to say who's affected by it, or what is affected by it. Because you need to remember who or what you're doing it for. Those of you who have worked with written requirements, a requirement normally has a list of stakeholders to say who's asked for it, so that when they leave the company, you can go through and strike all the requirements off and cut down your backlog. Yeah, a few knowing smiles there. We've all done it. Well, with coding standards, you want to remember why you're doing it. Or rather, who and what it's for, because it's not really why. It's not explaining the reasoning behind it. And we talk about these as impacted functions. And they're sometimes people, and they're sometimes capabilities. And here's again some examples I've used. Sometimes the reason you're doing it is for the sake of the end user. Sometimes you're doing it for your operations team. Sometimes you're doing it for your security team. Even sometimes you're doing it for your QA team, although that sadly is a bit rare. It'd be nice if it was more. But once again, that's not an exhaustive list. In your own organizations, you'll find your own functions, identify them, and put them together. And finally, we get to the description, which is where a lot of people try to start with coding standards. And as you'd expect, it tells you actually what to do. It's instructional. Now, in writing style, you're not trying to keep this down to 1 or 2 sentences. Use as much as you need to make sure everybody can follow it consistently. Once again, use active voice as a writing style with this, and again, avoid ambiguity. Because if your description is ambiguous, once again, you will spend hours and hours and hours in meetings arguing over whether something's been done or not. Write your standards to avoid those. So that's what a coding standard that actually improves quality uses. This is taken from work I've done for a client. It was a big project. It was 50 developers, where I was brought in to write the standards and then do reviews across all the different teams to see that they were being followed. This stuff does work, and it can work across multiple organizations simultaneously as well. Now that's the barest minimum. You may be lucky enough to have a bit more time, you may have a more relaxed schedule, or you may be able to afford to put more dedicated staff on it rather than writing it between you. It's great if you can actually put examples in. Now, one way to get examples as you're going along is if you're in a code review and something particularly egregious pops up, actually add that to your documentation to remind people about it. And for example, if a coding standard's there because of some problem that's been shipped, document it. Don't just put a link to a JIRA ticket. Yeah, because once a JIRA ticket's marked as done, no one ever reads them ever again. Assume JIRA will die and put it directly in this document. Make sure it's a standalone living document, please. Now, I've got a question for you. If the why isn't documented, is there any point to these coding standards? Would you always want the why in a coding standard? Could you cope without it? What do you think? Show of hands, who's happy? Who thinks that the why should always be mandatory? There's no right answer. I'm asking your opinions. Chris, sort of. Anyone else? Yeah, Mark? Sorry? It does indeed.
I think whilst the team that originally came up with it are all working on the project,
yeah.
the why is being optional is fine, but as soon as you start getting people leaving and joining the team.
Yeah, you lose that institutional knowledge. Yeah. The challenge with the why, it's the old 80-20 rule. That why can take as much time as writing the main bulk of your documentation, the main bulk of your coding standards, and not everyone can afford it. So it can be tricky. Now, to finish off, I just want to share some general guidance if I've managed to convince you to go down this route.